Hello and welcome to Talent Acquisition Trends and Strategy. Today we are joined by Elena Agar. Elena, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, we're really pumped to have you here as well. Thanks for joining us. And before we jump into it today, could you provide some background on your experience and what you're up to right now?
Yeah, sure. So originally I come from a background of higher education and learning, spent a few years in that, got bored pretty quickly because higher education takes its time in many ways. And I'm a person that needs results. So decided to shift towards corporate learning. Naturally, I felt like I've dealt with the younger population. Now I'm ready to go for that experienced profile of a learner. So last few years, I've been doing that kind of transition towards learning and development space. And in recent couple of years, talent acquisition as well. I feel it was just something that came naturally. In 2019, I've also co-founded a small ed tech company where we focus on performance and well-being in organizations. So that's been a great experience. Spent 8 years of my life living abroad in the Middle East, done this kind of work globally. So, and to recognize that a lot of the issues we are having as people and corporates are pretty global and standard across many different industries and nations.
Love it. Love it. Well, thanks for that background. And, one of the topics we discussed kind of bringing up today is really learning and development and making learning a core part of a company's culture. I'd love to just get your thoughts on that high level from a strategy perspective and why that's so important. And then maybe we could dive into some tactics in terms of how startups, growth stage companies can actually implement that and make it a core part of their culture and day to day.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I kind of started my career in that higher education space where I was on the flip side of how universities prepared students for future of work. And in recent years, I mean, this has been a problem for years and years, but in recent years, this gap between universities and corporates has grown so much that corporates are starting to realize that they cannot get away without having a proper learning and development structure in place. Because the reality is, the likelihood is you're not going to have talent walking through your door ready to kind of rock and roll. You're going to have to invest in them and develop them. And not only that, but furthermore, you also then have to continually develop them because the world of work and business is moving faster than we can ever kind of keep up with. So not only is it the responsibility of the individual to maintain their relevance in the workplace, but also an opportunity for companies to create that space for people to continue to learn. And from a pure business perspective, it is very costly to hire and fire and let go of people and to have people coming in and out. For talent acquisition folks, it takes a lot of energy to recruit a person, right? So a lot of resources and time goes into that. So one of the best ways to keep that person engaged, particularly for younger generations coming in, which I feel like is a whole other podcast, but just the generational differences between what corporates were to what they are today in terms of the profile of talent that we have there's a huge difference. So to keep that young talent engaged is part of the learning and development initiatives that every company must have. And I think it's becoming more and more obvious to CEOs and leadership. And a final point I'll mention here is that if you look at any report when it comes to the future of skills talent, 2016, you look at what do CEOs look for when it comes to top skills they want their people to have. And in 2016, the top 10, no matter which report you look at, it's a lot of digital skills, a lot of information technology, a lot of those tech skills, those computer skills. And maybe at the bottom, there might be two that are around soft skills like critical thinking and emotional intelligence. Report 2022, now we see top skills are those soft skills, emotional intelligence, people management, creativity, etc. And digital literacy is kind of taking the back end because although those IT skills and cyber skills are still important, those soft skills are becoming even more important. And yet again, this is also part of learning and development strategies, right? Is how do we continue to develop the skill set of our people? And so it's no longer take a certificate, it's a continuous ongoing learning strategy that needs to be in place because soft skills are, unlike hard skills, are an ongoing journey for everybody.
Yeah, for sure. And I think too, just in terms of hiring top talent, I think A players, like the best people out there, they're typically going to be looking for opportunities where, 20 to 30% of the job is doing something that they haven't done before. because why else are they going to accept the position if they're doing the exact same thing that they were doing in their prior role? So I think it also, from a talent acquisition perspective, it gives companies an advantage. I think the challenge is, and this is more so I'd say for like startups and growth stage companies, is, how do you actually structure learning and development, and how do you make it a core part of like the process in your business, and how much do you really need to invest financially in order to make it happen? Do you have any advice to companies that maybe are around the size of Horizon, where you're head of talent acquisition? I think it's around like what, 300 people?
Yeah. So globally, okay. So it's a global company, 300 people, kind of globally, 100, a little bit over 100 US based.
Okay.
And so absolutely, and this is a company that has never had talent and development until a year and a half ago when I joined them. So number one step for anybody in this space is to have the buy-in of leadership. And so naturally, a company who is interested to invest in that needs to recognize that leadership buy-in has to be there. So, but with that being said, oftentimes, even when the leadership buy-in is there, I think there needs to be a very clear discussion around what does that really mean to have their buy-in, which means a lot of times their face time with their employees, because they have to be carrying the values and behaviors that they want their employees to carry. It doesn't work otherwise. It's very difficult. It works, it will work, but it will work in like little increments. If we want to truly embed in a company culture, a learning and development kind of that culture of learning, right? It has to start from the top. So that's rule number one. Make sure you have the buy-in. Make sure that people, that whoever's managing the finances understands that it is an investment, but long-term, there are numbers associated in terms of money value associated with having well-structured and well-executed learning and development initiatives. And again, we can get into that a little bit more. There's a lot of metrics around that these days. So that's step number one. Step number two is really just that I think this is the big one for a lot of new companies, small companies. As a company grows, having a very solid foundation in terms of what do we want to stand for? What are our values? What is our mission? What kind of company we're trying to be, right? And then kind of building around that culture. This is one of the biggest challenges. And even in my own startup, as we are growing, when you're a small team, you can kind of manage the culture, right? As you're growing, if it's not under control in terms of people really truly practice the values and behavior that you stand for, it becomes messy. And then you become siloed. One department does, another one doesn't, somebody in one country doesn't. And what that does is it helps, it breaks people apart in terms of connectivity. So they don't feel like they're part of the team, and they might feel a little bit excluded. There's loneliness aspect, especially if you're a remote company. And all of that is part of learning and development. I think that's another thing to recognize, is that learning and development is not like trainings and learnings and leadership. No, it is culture of the company. It is your brand, the company brand, and how are you perceived by the market? Because nowadays, the young generation is coming in. The first thing they're going to do is Google your company. They're going to see what is your social media presence. They're going to see how your website, is it outdated and looks like from the 80s, or is it pretty up to date, right? So I think, so that's a part of it. Learning and development is another part of it. So I think just those are the basics that I would recommend people to consider, which is often overlooked. And instead, what people do is they just throw some trainings. They say, we're just going to train everybody to be a better manager, and we're going to do it once a month, and then everybody's going to be a great manager. And it doesn't work, because soft skills require continuous micro learnings, hands-on experience, continuous feedback, and improvements as it goes along. So I'll pause here.
Yeah. In terms of soft skills, what I did is, as I particularly for our people managers that are people that are managing like larger teams at Secure Vision, we implemented an executive coach to come in and help, particularly people moving up into leadership roles for the first time. And that's really, I think, given us a pretty good lift. When I initially started managing people, I hired an executive coach that really helped me, be able to essentially communicate high standards and high empathy at the same time, right? Because you need both. You need to be able to lead with standards and performance if you're going to actually have a high performing team, but you also need to be able to connect with people, right? So that's one thing we did. Then from like a learning and development perspective, not so much on the soft skills side, but we're also really into process playbooks. So for like literally every part of our business, we have detailed step-by-step guides on how to do everything. So when people are onboarded, we actually like they go through our process playbooks. We have trainings scheduled for them, and our trainings are primarily, it's like video based. And then they have follow-up conversations. They have like a buddy, right, when they start. But a lot of our L&D is really more so like front loaded into onboarding. And we don't, besides like executive coaching for leaders, we don't really have much else in terms of like L&D beyond like just more so informal stuff. Like somebody's working on a new project and they have to, basically what we do is companies borrow recruiters from us, right? So we're RPO, but basically that just means that we have embedded recruiters at our customers. So, sometimes recruiters will be working on new roles for the first time or something like that. So there's trainings on tech recruiting or trainings on revenue recruiting or G&A roles. So we do little stuff like that, but it's not like monthly we are doing like regimented kind of L&D training. So I'm just curious to get your thoughts, like moving a little bit into tactics. Like, what does this really look like for growth stage organizations? Like, how is it just like one-on-ones with the managers, or is it like more official trainings on the department level? What do you think there?
Sure. So a couple of points there. So on one side, having great managers that can have those conversations and build those relationships is definitely one of the most important aspects. But before you even get to that, so that I feel like it should be like kind of parallel. So one part of it is like, what does the business need? What does the business need, and where are the gaps in your current staff, or where do you foresee might be a gap in the future, or an obstacle based on the people you have and the skills they have that is going to either, probably stop you from moving forward in your business, right? So I think just making sure that the business strategy is aligned with the skills that people have, and are you going to be able to maintain that competitive edge moving forward in whatever industry you're at. And your people are your business, so you need to make sure that everybody's kind of up to par on that. On the other side is managers understanding the strengths of their people, understanding areas where people need to improve, particularly when working with younger teams. A lot of times they're not even sure what their gaps are. So I think being a coach and a mentor as a manager, I think that's the role that a manager should take on. Like in this day and age, it's not just about getting people to get things done and do it effectively, but it's how can you coach and mentor them to help them kind of grow in their own careers, right? To get them to take accountability in their own growth. So I don't think it's all on the managers. I think there's two folds here. And I always say this, like individuals and companies. Companies, have certain responsibility to offer resources and provide that training as needed. But individuals also need to be, to have their own kind of go-getter mentality. And the best way to influence this is to have managers and leadership that leads by example. So leadership that talks about things that they're doing in terms of continuous learning, right? A leadership that supports on-the-job learning, out of the job learning. I'll give you an example. So many of the big companies have they give their team members, a time during a week or once a month to work on passion projects, right? It's more of just to keep people curious and passionate and innovative, because a lot of times out of those projects, this is how they maintain their curiosity and motivation. So naturally, everybody benefits, even if they're not working on a particular company problem. So I think just creating that support system is important. Something else that companies have is called future teams. And it depends on the size of your company and kind of, time allocated, but you can form 2-3 people that their pure job, or maybe once a month, again, whatever makes sense, timeline that makes sense. And all they spend time is looking at possible threats that are coming your way, looking at emerging technology that might impact your industry, looking at competition that's coming out, looking at future trends that your company and your team need to prepare for. So that way you tailor your learning and development that is preparing your company for that, those future trends and future impacts that might take place. I would say, yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. My bad.
Please.
Okay, yeah. So I was just gonna ask, what are your thoughts on somehow tying in L&D into performance management for leaders and possibly even for individual contributors? I feel like the only way to get it done is making it measurable and making it if we're gonna make it a core part of the culture, it should be something that's it's measured and it's expected in terms of accountability and in terms of hey, this is something that is important to us. So, X amount of time or X amount, whatever metric it might be needs to be hit on a quarterly basis, for instance, right?
Yeah, I'm kind of on the fence with that one. It depends. If you're in the world of government contracting, as the company I'm working with, it's very difficult to have people allocate specific numbers, let's say in a month, right? So they're limited in terms of, so if people that are listening to this have those billable teams, it becomes challenging. And also on the flip side, when you tend to put those kind of pressures on people, a lot of times like, oh, here we go, yet another training. So at the same time, I have, I'm on the fence with it. So on one side, like, I feel like, I don't know if it's the best approach, but on the other side, there are people that simply, unless you actually, enforce it on them, they might not do it.
Right.
In an ideal world, right, what I think sells and what I think works, if again done properly, but it's difficult to do, is if the company culture it's so embedded in the company culture that employees are naturally ongoing learners. And again, that only works if everybody in the company practices this, especially leadership and management. So it's by default, people are going to be learners. And you can create, there are companies out there who only hire, only sustain high performers, or only sustain certain people. So which is a different challenge, because not everybody can have those top performers. Not everybody can have that kind of culture. But there are people who are like, listen, if you're not curious, and if you're not innovative, if you don't have that entrepreneurship mindset, you're not going to make it in this company. But so, I mean, that's one way. So I'm on the fence with that. I think that it is good to have metrics, but again, that's not how you motivate people. How you motivate people is by leading by example and getting them excited. And how you get them excited is to try to align their personal goals with organizational goals. And naturally, if people are doing something they're passionate about and they feel like they're adding value, they're going to be naturally curious and wanting to be the best that they can be. And by default, when you're at your best that you can be, everybody benefits, including companies, etc. To tie into to performance, yeah, you can. But again, I think that it's not just about ticking the boxes. It's about having continuous conversations and check-ins with team members. So gone are the days, obviously, that we have 2 reviews a year, right? So a lot of companies now are moving towards 4 official check-ins throughout the year that are recorded, like in whatever system they use. And then in between that, they have regular check-ins with their team members, depending on the size of their team, depending on time. But maybe it's weekly checkpoints, right? Aligning on short-term goals, long-term goals for the people, and keeping them accountable. I think that will go a long way versus putting, and let me also add that creating customized learning journeys for each person that are individual to what they want to learn, that is aligned with company goals. That is going to motivate people, and that works. It really is a strategy. It's something we do at Horizon, and we've implemented, and it works. And we have a high attendance of people attending our sessions that we call learning and development units, and they're not required. They're just encouraged.
Yeah.
And
I think it can also just be correlated to career tracking and progression within the company. So, if somebody wants to move up and be promoted into a people manager role, or into a team lead capacity, or maybe even it's just like to a senior level individual contributor role, that again, that's how I kind of like it, like the performance angle too, because then it's like measurable and tangible. Like, all right, like, what are you doing to further your skill sets and improve? Like, whether that's, taking a course, or, just asking really engaging questions when you do your one-on-ones with your manager. So I feel like some, engagement and initiative and these types of things can be tied into, who's going to become eligible for certain like promotion paths, right? Which is, again, like, even if it's not tied into performance, like leadership's obviously looking at that as one of the reasons why somebody would move up within the company. What are your thoughts? Like right now, it's kind of like a buzzy term, but a lot of people are talking about quiet quitting, like this idea of a lack of employee engagement. I'm just kind of like, I don't know. I mean, apparently they're saying like half of the workforce, particularly like the younger generation, is like very disengaged with their jobs right now. I haven't really experienced that at my team. My team seems pretty engaged and doing quite well, but apparently this is a big problem. Have you heard anything about this? And if so, like, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a trendy thing that's happening right now, right? I think
Yeah.
that there's a lot of trend around that. I don't see it as much as well, but it's been happening. So realistically, so I think it's just like, again, I think it's just a trend that people decided to talk about. But if you look at any Gallup report, so I'm obsessed with reports in general. So this I read them for fun. And if you look at any report over the last several years, Gallup report. So Gallup, for those that don't know, so they do a lot of kind of workforce research and surveys and stuff like that. They do it globally. So they release a beautiful report every year. It's called the Global Employee Engagement, something like that. And basically, it asks they study like hundreds of different companies that are top global companies, thousands of employees, and to understand their level of engagement. Pretty steadily over the last several years, the level of engagement. Do you want to take a guess how many people are, let me say, how many people are disengaged in a workplace? We're talking about multinationals, corporates, small to medium sized to large companies. Any guess of how many of those
I mean,
are
from the
disengaged?
articles I'm seeing, it's pretty high. But I don't know actually. Like I haven't done the research myself. Yeah.
So it's been over 75% of people disengaged. And this has been like for a very long time. So over 74% of the global workforce are disengaged in their roles. So this quiet quitting is kind of, it's just a highlighting that basically, but that's been the case for a long time. And again, I think that's a whole other podcast because there's a lot of challenges with that. Part of it starts with our education system, and having spent a few years in higher education, I can tell you that a big reason that people go into jobs they don't like is because they spend 4 years or 6 years or 8 years studying degrees, spending a lot of money, and for better or for worse, it's the only job they're going to get is based on what they studied or based on whatever job they could get. And then the reality hits, the bills hit, etc. So different topic, but relevant to that. And so when you so it's a whole system. It's not just like, oh, people are quiet quitting. They've been doing that forever. They've been doing it for years. And part of that is because education and the corporates don't speak to each other. Part of it is because we're not taught at a younger age, at university level, even at an entry point of our career, that it's okay to change careers. It's okay to change your mind. That there's a lot more that you can do versus just pursuing whatever you studied and whatever you spend time on. So, and part of that is I still put a heavy emphasis on the individual, because I think that as individuals, we have to take responsibility of how we are progressing in our careers. And if you're not happy, and if you like, if you feel like you're not progressing, then, if your company is not giving you what you want, move on.
Yeah.
But a lot of people stay, and for different reasons. So some of those reasons are justifiable because not everybody has an option to change careers, and people have responsibilities and bills to pay. But a big portion of these corporate employees have an opportunity to change, and they don't. And a lot of times because they don't know how, they don't know what's next, etc., which is where coaching comes in. But I can spend hours on that topic alone. But I think it's just a trend. I think it's just a trend, and yeah.
And they're saying like a lot of this is focused on Gen Z. And I think the other thing too, I think it's in order to cut down on this stuff, I think one thing we have to stop doing is we have to stop obsessing on tenure so much of employees. Like, if this concept of like job hopping, I just find to be very antiquated. Like, there are very few positions where in order to have a return on an employee, they have to be there for 2 or 3 years. Like, the reality is that there's way too much of an emphasis on tenure and not enough of emphasis on learning, development, onboarding, training, accelerating ramp. Like, there should be much more an emphasis on building process around accelerating ramp so people can start to add value sooner, because ultimately people, when they join a company, they're going to be more excited, they're going to be passionate, they're going to bring different perspectives to the table. And I don't see it as the worst thing in the world if people leave after a year. Like, to me, it's like, talent acquisition system should be built out to where they're able to consistently recruit positions at scale. We should be focused on helping people continue to grow in their careers so we can get the best fit individuals on the team, and normalize the concept that, it's okay for somebody to not want to be here forever, or for the long term. So I think that's like, this concept of quiet quitting might also be from the perspective of people feeling like, well, shit, I can't move after 1 year because I did that in my last job, and now I have to be here 2.5 years before I can move on to something else. And so they ultimately become disengaged, when it'd be much better for that person to move on and to get somebody new on the team that's excited to be there. Like, I think that's part of it.
For sure. Absenteeism costs a lot of money to companies. I don't know, it's like a few $1,000s every year per employee that companies lose by employees who absenteeism is basically sitting in front of the computer. You're kind of checked in, but you're actually checked out. So you're not actually producing. You're just there. You're doing the bare minimum to not get fired. But again, it goes back to relationships with managers. It goes back to communicating. It goes back to having those strong connections where people, if I'm in disengaged, I tell you, James, I'm completely checked out. You need to do something. You need to help me, right? Or here's what I'm thinking, James, and here's how you can support me. Can this company do this for me? How can I add more value, right? Etc. But again, it's two-way conversation. People don't speak up and they expect things from companies, and it's not always the case. So taking accountability for their own career development. And at the same time, like you said, it's okay if people want to move on. And another thing for companies, again, depending on the stage that they're at, talent mobility. Can you find something else for them to do? This happens a lot in the tech world. People will go into different techs, whether it's Appian, whether it's Salesforce, whether it's Python, and they get bored with the technology after 2-3 years. And if the company cannot provide them an opportunity to learn other tech and to implement that tech, they're going to leave. So as a company, can you provide an opportunity for them to do what they want to do internally before they jump ship?
Right. But also it's like, I think it's a balancing act, right? Like sometimes that's good. And then also sometimes it's better to find the specialist opposed to training somebody up in a new function to pull in an external person that comes to the table with that skill set. Again, like the more experience I get, I'm moving away from like obsessing on tenure and retention at all costs. Like I'm thinking more in terms of like, who's the best person for this role right now? And let's have candid conversations about what you want to do after working at Secure Vision, like my company, right? Like, it's okay. Like, I don't have an expectation of like loyalty. I have an expectation for us to be aligned and understand what performance looks like and understand how I can help you achieve your goals in your career. Let's be transparent with that. But also I understand that, like, look, if you want to move up into a management position or lead here, we could talk about that and I could show you the path to make that happen. But if you want to use this as an opportunity to develop a certain skill set and then move on, let's talk about that too and see how we can make that happen. And I really do think performance management is a big part of avoiding things like quiet quitting, right? Like there has to be clear expectations on what a role is accountable for. Of course, you want some people to go like above and beyond is great because then, it's like, okay, these could be future leaders potentially within the company. But the reality is that it's just like, okay, you're being paid to do a thing. We should be very clear on what that thing is. And if they're doing it well, we don't necessarily need them to go above and beyond. We just need them to hit the core metrics of their position. And I think it's really that simple. Like, I think a lot of companies just don't set clear expectations with employees on what success looks like.
Agreed.
And I think that that's a huge issue. I mean, if companies did better at that, then you wouldn't have this quiet quitting thing because you would know very well if people are doing what they need to do or they're not, right? And there's always going to be a percentage of people that go above and beyond. Great. Those people know who they are, encourage them, give them raises quickly and make sure you spend more time with them, career pathing and making sure they get what they need. I mean, I think it should be done that way. And I think that maybe that's why I'm not seeing that problem at Secure Vision. But I think a lot of companies get this wrong is all I'm saying.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. Absolutely. I think expectations are high, and also, I mean, now I'm going to sound like a lot older than I am. I'm not that old, but, I feel like we've become a little bit soft. And so it's almost like sometimes managers are afraid to tell their people they need to work a little bit harder and hit metrics, because then we go into the whole well-being piece. And it's like, well, you're actually just asking them to do their job. And if they cannot fulfill that. So, but now there's a lot of trend around that. And I think we have to be very careful to distinguish between what does it mean to just do your job and do it well and do it effectively as you're hired to do, versus hitting burnout. So we don't want people to hit burnout, but we also don't want people to take it easy and do the bare minimum. So expectations, I think, are very, very important. So you're spot on with that.
Well, so I think too, it's like, everybody's been talking about emotional intelligence for the last several years. And I think people they're not seeing the full picture. Like empathy is important, but so are standards. So is accountability. And just because empathy and emotional intelligence is important doesn't mean that accountability isn't. And I think you're right. Like the conversation has shifted so far around like concept of like work-life balance, work-life integration, these types of things that um, I think in some environments, there's like almost this fear to focus on accountability. And you got to be careful. Like again, like, and this comes down to getting the right executive coaching, making sure leadership understands how to communicate both of these things at the same time. You know, we need a culture that thrives on accountability. Everybody needs to be accountable and clear. Clear expectations need to be set, right? There has to be kind of a standard in terms of like the work product produced, right? We need to be transparent in communicating feedback, these types of things. And you're right. I think that there quite honestly is a bit of an accountability problem that we're seeing out there in some cases. And I think that that's like, again, it's like, if you want to know, everybody has the choice, right? How much do you want to put into your career based on who you want to become? And there's no right or wrong, right? You can invest a lot in your career. You can invest a little bit, but the reality is that inputs lead to certain outputs. And if you want a certain output, you need to make sure that the work that you're putting in is aligned with that. And the only way to achieve truly, you know, in your career, if you that's important to you, the only way to really achieve what you want to do and take it to the next level is a high level of personal accountability when it comes to learning and development, when it comes to hitting the core metrics for your role. And yeah, I think the best high performing cultures, they're able to strike that balance, and they're able to attract talent that is aligned with that, right? That's aligned with that philosophy of like accountability alongside empathy. And they've kind of figured out how to communicate that as a leadership team. I feel like that's so critically important.
Something that I say that people don't like, I say, if you really want to grow in your career, that means you're probably going to have to devote time outside of your working hours and on weekends to do what you need to do to grow. Otherwise, you're just like everybody else, and you shouldn't. And again, like you said, it's a choice. But if you make that choice, and don't expect X, Y, and Z, expect what you're going to get, because that's how competitive it is. And again, it's just a choice. But the reality is that it's just taking ownership. You know, and I say a lot of careers die at mid-level, because once you hit that, everybody can get to mid-level. It's easy to get to mid-level. To get to that senior level, different ball game, different approach. It just, the same approach doesn't work. And you're not just going to float upwards. So it just doesn't work that way.
And that's okay. You know, if it's not okay, a priority, that's totally okay. It's just, again, it's like, yeah, you have to be realistic with what you're putting in. I mean, like, you know, obviously in my case, like my career is incredibly important to me. It's probably a bigger part of my identity than maybe it should be. But it's like, you know, during COVID, to keep my company, because as a hiring company, we got hammered in the middle of COVID, right? I was running talent acquisition for 3 companies while running my own company. I was working from like 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. We had a newborn at home. I mean, it was brutal. But, you know, again, it was important to me. And that's now why we are where we are. We're scaling. The company is successful. That's a big part of it, because, you know, you do what you have to do to that is, and it needs to be aligned with the goals and the outcomes that you want. Now, like my case is kind of an extreme, right? Because I wanted to scale and own a company, but I think it's, again, you have to know like what is the input required for the outcome you want to achieve. And, you know, I mean, it's like in the short term, obviously, it might be less in people's control, right? Like, you know, if you're working hard for 6 months and you don't get what you want, that doesn't mean that it's not working. You know, it's about massive action, constantly iterating, being consistent over a long period of time. And if you do that, then you're going to be, you know, very successful in your career, right? Like, it's not something that, you know, you can just put in, like, work really hard for 3 months, you know, like it takes years and years to develop the skill sets and the experience and the reputation and everything that you need to move up in your career.
Now, consistency is key. Consistency versus intensity. And I bet you that you probably very much enjoy what you do, which is why it makes it slightly easier, although you're still human, but I bet it's slightly easier for you to put in the work hours, the long hours, because you enjoy what you do. And I think that's what a lot of people are missing. And again, that's a whole other conversation. But when you enjoy what you do, when it gives you energy, even if you are tired at the end of the day, you have that purpose, and that's what drives you. And I think that's a big part of that's my wish for everybody, is that they find that for themselves.
Yeah, I hope they do too. And I have a lot of empathy for people that don't have that. The reality of the world, though, is sometimes you have to start with the roles that you don't feel that, like, you have to deliver on those types of positions to then get in. And that's a very sensitive topic in 2022, because not everybody agrees with that. It certainly wasn't my life experience. I had to take, I was in an SDR role, 100 cold calls a day, 3 in-person meetings, really high quotas. It sucked. But again, it's like, it's a starting point. So I think too, it's like when you want to move up, like you have to be willing to understand, like, hey, I'm playing the long game. I need to be patient. I need to understand there's certain steps here, and where I'm starting is not necessarily where I'm going to end up, but this is a natural progression, right? And that you have to start somewhere, right? I think just having realistic expectations surrounding that is just really important for people as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, anyways, yeah, this was a ton of fun. I think this is probably a good stopping point for us. And so, Elena, I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today on the show. And, I really appreciate your insights and what you brought to the table today.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, if people want to engage with you, what's the best way for them to engage with you online or to reach out?
Sure. So I'm mostly active on LinkedIn. So you can just find me on LinkedIn. It's Elena Agar. I'll probably come up. My actual name is Agaragimova. Maybe just drop it in the notes for this episode, so they don't have to they don't have to search for it. But LinkedIn is probably the best. That's where I hang out at the most.
I love it. Sounds good. And for everybody tuning in, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time. Take care.